The headache started faintly, like a dull throb at the back of my skull, and I tried to push it aside. After all, I had a job to do. I was presenting the Titan Sport apparel rebrand to the client, a project I'd been working on for months. This was my chance to prove myself at Aurora Creative Labs, to show them I was capable of more than just the behind-the-scenes work I'd always done. This rebrand was my moment. I was standing at the conference table, pointing to a series of slides, explaining the vision behind our designs, when the headache intensified. At first, I ignored it, taking deep breaths, trying to focus on the room full of executives who seemed intrigued by my pitch. But the pressure in my head began to grow, like something pressing in from all sides. My vision blurred. My mouth felt dry, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I told myself it was just stress, that I'd pushed myself too hard. But as the pain became unbearable, I stumbled over my words. I tried to keep going, but everything in the room started to fade. The faces in front of me twisted into something unfamiliar, and I could feel my knees give out. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in a hospital bed, a soft beeping sound filling the air. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic tap of someone's shoes echoed in the hallway outside. My first instinct was to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as if it had been drained of energy. I blinked a few times, trying to get my bearings. Dr. Rivera was sitting beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady, but filled with concern. "Maya, you're at Rocky Mountain Regional Hospital," she said gently. "You passed out during your presentation. How are you feeling?" I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat was dry. The words caught in my throat. I tried to remember what had happened, but my mind felt like it was still in a fog. "You collapsed," she continued, her voice calm but direct. "We did some tests, and there's something we need to talk about." She paused, giving me a moment to process. "You have a tumor, Maya, a meningioma, located in the right frontal lobe." I didn't know what to say. A tumor? My heart raced as I processed the word. I didn't know anything about meningiomas, only that the word tumor was terrifying. I wanted to ask questions, but all I could focus on was the growing tightness in my chest. I could feel my breath quickening, and before I knew it, I was gasping for air. "Maya, you're going to be okay," Dr. Rivera said, her voice firm but reassuring. "It's not malignant, but we need to schedule surgery to remove it. It's pressing on certain areas of your brain, and that's what caused the headaches and fainting." I nodded slowly, trying to process everything she was telling me. Surgery. The thought terrified me. But I was a professional. I'd handled difficult projects, tough clients, and high-pressure deadlines. Surely I could handle a surgery. But the thought of something being wrong in my brain, in my very head, made me feel vulnerable in a way I'd never felt before. I asked about my parents. I needed to talk to them, to hear their voices. I'd called them when I first got to the hospital, but there had been no answer. I tried again, dialing their numbers, but the ringing tone was a hollow echo. After several minutes, I sent them a text message, asking them to come to Denver. I needed them, but when the hours passed and they still hadn't arrived, I began to feel the familiar pang of disappointment. It wasn't that I expected them to drop everything and come running, but I thought they'd at least acknowledge how serious this was. I had always felt like the afterthought in my family. My sister Brianna was the one who always got the praise, the attention, the support. And it had been that way since we were kids. Growing up in suburban Pennsylvania, Brianna was the perfect daughter, straight A's, first chair in the orchestra, head cheerleader. And then there was me, quiet, reserved, never quite living up to the expectations my parents had for me. I was smart, I did well in school, but I wasn't the star. Brianna was. And every time I did something, whether it was acing a test or landing a big client at work, it felt like it didn't matter. Because Brianna's accomplishments always overshadowed mine. So when my parents didn't show up that day, when they spent hours at Hershey Park with Brianna and her husband Colin, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. I called them again, this time with tears threatening to spill. I needed them here, but I wasn't going to beg them to care. "We'll come as soon as we can," my mother's voice crackled through the phone. "We're at Hershey Park with Brianna. She's having such a great time. But we'll be there soon. Don't worry. I could hear the sounds of amusement park rides in the background. Children laughing, the faint scream of roller coasters. And it was like a knife to the heart. I wasn't a child anymore, but in that moment, I felt like the forgotten one. I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything. I was alone in this. And it wasn't the first time. I spent the next few days in that hospital room, the world outside seemingly distant and irrelevant. The soft beeping of machines, the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, the smell of antiseptic, it all started to feel like home in its own strange way. The pain in my head had subsided a little after the medication kicked in, but it was the crushing realization that I couldn't rely on my family that weighed most heavily on me. I had always been the one to keep things together for them, taking on the responsibility of helping with bills when my parents struggled, offering emotional support when Brianna needed it, but when the roles reversed, it was clear. I wasn't the priority. But I wasn't alone. Despite my family's absence, new faces began to step into my life, and they brought with them a warmth I hadn't expected. It was humbling in a way, seeing how the people who barely knew me could offer so much care and support, while those who should have been there for me failed to even acknowledge the gravity of my situation. Tia was one of the first people from work to visit. She'd only started at Aurora Creative Labs a few months ago, but from the moment we met, we clicked. She was approachable, kind-hearted, and always ready with a smile. I didn't expect her to visit, let alone take time off work to check on me, but she did. Every day, without fail, she showed up. "Hey, Maya," Tia said the first time she walked into my room, a bag of fresh coffee in hand. She was wearing a casual hoodie and leggings, the kind of outfit I'd wear on a lazy weekend, but it felt like she had come to me in armor. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," I said, though the words didn't match how I felt. I didn't want to burden her with my emotions, but I could tell she saw through my attempt at masking my distress. She didn't sit in the chair next to my bed like most visitors. Instead, she pulled a chair right up to me, sitting so close that our knees almost touched. There was a sense of intimacy to it, something simple and human that made me feel a little less isolated. "I brought you something," she said, handing me the coffee. It was warm and comforting, a small but significant gesture that felt like a lifeline. We talked for hours that day. Tia didn't seem to mind the silence that often filled the gaps between our conversations. She didn't push, didn't make me talk about what I was going through unless I wanted to. And when I did speak, when the words spilled out about my family's neglect, about the frustration that I'd spent my whole life being overshadowed by Brianna, she just listened. "Sometimes people don't see us, Maya," she said softly, her voice gentle. "But that doesn't mean you're invisible. You're not. You've been through a lot, and it's okay to feel angry about it." Her words resonated with me more than I expected. I was used to bottling up my emotions, to pretending I was fine even when I wasn't. But Tia gave me permission to feel, to admit that I had been hurt. And it felt freeing. As the days passed, I began to realize just how much Tia's visits meant to me. She wasn't just someone from work who had come to check on me out of obligation. She was someone who genuinely cared about me as a person, not just as a colleague. That was a rare thing, and I began to appreciate it more than I could put into words. The hospital staff became another unexpected source of support. Carla, a nurse who worked the night shift, was particularly kind. She was a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, but there was a softness to her too. I first met her during one of my late-night checks, when I was struggling to sleep due to the post-surgery pain. "How are you doing tonight?" she asked as she adjusted my foredrip. "Could be better," I replied, trying to hide the frustration in my voice. I hadn't been able to sleep for days, and the dull ache in my head never seemed to completely fade. Carla studied me for a moment before sitting down in the chair beside my bed. "You're not a fan of the hospital life, are you?" she asked, her tone teasing but warm. I chuckled softly, despite myself. "Not really. I'd rather be at work. Or anywhere else, honestly." She nodded in understanding. "You're not the first one who said that. Hospital life is, well, it's not meant to be enjoyable. But you're in good hands here." I appreciated the reassurance, but more than that, I appreciated how she didn't treat me like a patient who was just another case to manage. She treated me like a person, with kindness and dignity. In a place filled with people who were just doing their jobs, Carla stood out as someone who actually cared. And then there were the other patients in the ward, the small group of people who, despite their own struggles, found the time to check in on me, offer words of comfort, and remind me that I wasn't alone. Harold, a retired teacher in his late 60s, was the first to strike up a conversation. He'd been in the hospital for a few days already, recovering from heart surgery. He had a dry sense of humor and an easy smile, which made him an instant favorite among the patients. When he found out I was recovering from brain surgery, he insisted on sharing his story. "I've been through 2 bypass surgeries," he said with a wink. "If I can survive that, you can survive anything. Trust me, you've got this." His words, though simple, gave me a sense of strength I didn't realize I needed. It was the reminder that resilience wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built over time, through challenges, through survival. Lena, a middle-aged woman recovering from a knee replacement, was another bright light. She was soft-spoken but had an infectious laugh that always made me smile, even on my toughest days. Matteo, a young man in his 20s who had been in a car accident, was full of life and energy, despite his injuries. Agnes and Trevor, older than the rest of us, provided a sense of steadiness to the group. They had been through their own hardships and yet seemed to find joy in the small things, the little victories of recovery, the shared camaraderie in the ward. In a strange way, they became my support system. I had always thought family was supposed to be a rock, but here I was, relying on strangers to get me through the hardest time of my life. And then there was Grandpa Walter. Even though I hadn't seen him in years, his voice, weak but still familiar, was a lifeline. When Robert texted that Grandpa had suffered a stroke, my heart dropped. Walter had always been the one person in my family who saw me for who I truly was, who recognized my worth even when no one else did. And in that moment, I needed him more than ever. The thought of losing him, the one person who had always been on my side, filled me with dread. I needed his wisdom, his strength, and his love. I just needed him to tell me everything was going to be okay. The days following Grandpa Walter's stroke were a blur of hospital visits, waiting rooms, and endless messages from relatives. But even in the midst of the chaos, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in my life had irrevocably shifted. Grandpa had always been the one person in my family who truly understood me. He had a way of seeing past all the surface-level nonsense and recognizing my quiet strength, even when I couldn't see it myself. I hadn't been able to get on a plane to Philadelphia yet. Doctors had advised against it due to my recent surgery. But the distance between me and my family felt insurmountable. I could still feel the sharp sting of their absence, the absence of my parents and sister, as they continued with their lives without so much as a second thought about my condition. It was as if I didn't even exist to them, beyond the occasional, obligatory text. But Grandpa Walter's message, despite the gravity of his condition, was a lifeline. The phone call we had, though brief, left me with a sense of urgency. It was as though he knew his time was running out and that I needed to hear the things he had been holding back for years. "Maya," his voice had been weak but steady. "I'm giving you the cabin at Silver Pine Lake. It's yours now. And I want you to speak your truth, child." I had never known Grandpa to be a man of many words. He wasn't one to offer unsolicited advice, and he certainly wasn't one to pressure me into anything. But those words, that one sentence, sent a ripple of realization through me. My whole life, I had been suppressing my truth, my anger, my resentment, because I'd always felt like I didn't deserve to speak up. I had been the quiet one, the one who didn't rock the boat. But Grandpa was asking me to do something I had never allowed myself to do, stand up for myself, for the first time in my life. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my parents' neglect or Brianna's favoritism. This was about me. For the first time in my life, I had permission to be seen, to speak up, to demand respect. The moment I arrived at Jefferson Hospital, I knew I had to confront them. I had no other choice. It wasn't just for me. It was for the younger version of myself who had never dared to ask for what she deserved. And it was for Grandpa Walter, who had always believed in me, even when I couldn't. When I walked into his hospital room, I saw him sitting up in bed, hooked up to monitors, his eyes still bright despite the frailty of his body. His presence filled the room like a warm, comforting blanket, and I immediately felt the pull of his love and strength. "Maya, my girl," he said, his voice raspy but full of affection. "I'm glad you're here." I leaned down to kiss his forehead, holding his hand tightly. "I'm here, Grandpa. I'll always be here." We talked for a while about old memories, about the lake cabin, about the things we used to do together. It felt like we were in a different world, one where time slowed down, and for a moment, I didn't have to worry about the mess of my family or the pain I was carrying. But then, in the silence between us, Grandpa turned to me, his face serious. "You know what you need to do, right?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. I nodded, my throat tight. "I do." He squeezed my hand. "You've been holding on to things for too long. It's time to speak your truth. Don't let them get away with it, Maya. Don't let them treat you like you're nothing." I swallowed hard, the tears threatening to spill. Grandpa had always been my rock, but in that moment, it felt like he was giving me the permission I had so desperately needed to take back control of my life. It was terrifying, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I had spent too many years being invisible, too many years allowing my parents and sister to walk all over me, and now it was time for that to end. A few days later, Tia and I boarded the train to Philadelphia. It wasn't the way I'd imagined confronting my family, but given my recent surgery and the doctor's orders to avoid flying, the train seemed like the safest option. The journey was long, and with each passing mile, the weight on my chest grew heavier. I had no idea how my parents would react. Would they defend their actions, as they always had? Would they apologize? Or would they continue to brush everything under the rug? Tia was the only person who knew the full extent of what had been happening in my family. She'd been there for me in the hospital, and now, she was here by my side, offering support in the way that no one else ever had. She had no agenda, no judgment. She just wanted me to be okay. "You don't have to do this alone, Maya," she said as we sat in our train seats, the hum of the engine vibrating beneath us. "I'll be with you every step of the way." I couldn't have asked for a better friend. Tia had become more than just a coworker. She had become my chosen family. When we arrived in Philadelphia, the familiar ache in my heart flared again. I hadn't seen my parents in months, and yet, it felt like I had never left. The house was the same, a large, imposing colonial-style home in the suburbs, with neatly manicured lawns and a feeling of coldness that had always been there. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. Robert and Linda were sitting in the living room, watching TV, as though nothing had happened. Brianna was there too, perched on the arm of the couch, scrolling through her phone. Everything felt frozen, like time had stood still in the years I'd been away. Robert looked up when I entered. "Maya," he said, his voice laced with a hint of annoyance, as though I were intruding on his space. "What are you doing here?" I didn't respond at first. I just stood there, taking in the faces of the people who had never truly seen me. The people who had taken so much from me and given so little in return. And then, without thinking, I spoke. "I need to talk to you all," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "About everything." The confrontation wasn't easy. My parents immediately went on the defensive, denying any wrongdoing, excusing their behavior, and continuing to put Brianna on a pedestal. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I told them, with everything I had, how their neglect had shaped me, how their constant favoritism had broken me, and how I could no longer allow them to treat me as if I didn't matter. Brianna, as always, stayed silent, but I saw the way she avoided eye contact. She knew, deep down, that I was right. Grandpa Walter had made sure of that. And when I was finished, when I had said everything I needed to say, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I couldn't fly to Philadelphia just yet, so I took the train with Tia, who stayed by my side as always. It was a long ride, and the train swayed rhythmically, offering some semblance of comfort as it trundled along the tracks. I found myself lost in my thoughts, my mind spiraling over the conversation that would soon unfold. The anxiety that had been gnawing at me for days intensified with each passing mile. I could feel the weight of the years I had spent swallowing my emotions, my resentments, and my pain, and I knew the moment had come for me to finally speak my truth. The closer we got to Philadelphia, the more my heart pounded. It wasn't the city I was afraid of, it was the family I was about to face. After all, the familiar ache of rejection and neglect wasn't something that could be washed away in a single confrontation. But Grandpa Walter's words echoed in my mind. Don't let them get away with it, Maya. He had always been my rock, the one person who saw me for who I truly was, and now he was gone. But his legacy, his belief in me, remained. And that was the strength I needed. When we finally arrived in Philadelphia, it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in on me as we stood outside my parents' house. The familiar colonial-style home loomed before me like a fortress, a place that once felt like safety but had long since become a battleground for unresolved feelings. I could almost feel the weight of the years that had passed, years of unspoken tension, of me trying to fit into a mold that didn't suit me. Tia squeezed my hand before we walked up to the front door.
You've got this, Maya.
And remember, I'm right here with you. I smiled weakly, grateful for her unwavering support. I wasn't alone in this, but it still felt like the hardest thing I'd ever done. Inside, Robert and Linda were sitting in the living room, engrossed in their usual routine. The TV was on, but the room felt strangely empty. Brianna was there, too, on her phone, as always, seemingly detached from the world around her. My parents didn't even acknowledge me at first, which only deepened the familiar sting of being overlooked, of being treated like I didn't matter. But I was determined to make them see me, to make them hear me. Maya, Robert said finally, his voice cold and dismissive. What are you doing here? The question hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone, the lack of warmth. I was the daughter who had been there for them through every difficult moment, and yet here I was, treated as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. I could feel the lump forming in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to let them break me. I need to talk to you all, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. About everything. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. I looked at Brianna, who was still avoiding my gaze, her eyes focused on her phone as if she could disappear into it. I couldn't help the bitterness that rose in my chest, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about Brianna, not directly. It was about my parents, about the way they had treated me for so long. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Linda looked at me, her face unreadable. Brianna, still silent, had not moved an inch. Go ahead, Maya, Robert finally said, his voice lacking any real concern. We're listening. But I wasn't fooled by the words. This wasn't a conversation. This was a performance, one in which they would try to justify their actions and dismiss my feelings. But I wasn't going to let that happen this time. Not anymore. With each word I spoke, I felt the weight I had carried for years begin to lift. I told them how their neglect had shaped me, how their favoritism toward Brianna had wounded me more than they could ever understand. How every success I had felt like it didn't matter because I was never their first priority. I told them how, on the day I needed them most, when I was lying in a hospital bed facing surgery, they were busy with Brianna at Hushy Park, as though I were invisible. I didn't hold back. Every emotion I had been hiding for years came rushing to the surface, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the right to say it. You've failed me, I said, the words feeling like they were finally leaving my body, like I could breathe again. You've treated me like I don't matter, and I can't do it anymore. I deserve better than this. The room fell silent. Robert's face reddened, and Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Brianna, still staring at her phone, looked more distant than ever. For a long moment, it felt as though nothing would change, that they would continue to dismiss me, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But then Grandpa's voice echoed in my mind once more. Speak your truth. And so I did. I continued, pouring out everything I had bottled up for so long, not just about the neglect, but about the emotional toll it had taken on me. About how, even as an adult, I had been waiting for their validation, for them to show up for me in the way they showed up for Brianna. But I was done waiting. When I finished, I expected them to argue, to make excuses. But instead, the silence hung thick between us. Robert didn't speak. Linda didn't respond. And Brianna, she didn't say a word either. It was as if they were all too stunned to even react. But even in that silence, I felt a sense of relief. I had said what needed to be said. I had claimed my voice, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to beg for their approval. Grandpa had been right. It was time to speak my truth. And I wasn't going to apologize for it. 3 weeks later, I stood at Silver Pine Lake, the cabin now officially mine, and I felt the weight of it all. I had gone through the motions of recovery, of reconciling with my family in my own way, but it was here, in this quiet, sacred place, that I truly felt like I was beginning to heal. Tia was there, too, helping me settle into the cabin, and it was as though we were creating our own family, one built on respect, honesty, and unconditional support. I had the space I needed to breathe, to rebuild, to let go of the hurt that had held me captive for far too long. In time, my parents tried to make amends. Robert reached out with a few half-hearted apologies, and Linda sent me flowers. Brianna, as always, kept her distance, preferring the comfort of her golden child status. But I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone to make me feel seen or valued. I had learned the hard way that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who respect you, who see you for who you truly are. I didn't need their approval. I had my own. And with Tia, Carla, Harold, Lena, Mateo, and the others from the hospital, I was surrounded by the kind of love I had always craved. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a family I had chosen, one that had shown up for me when my blood family couldn't. As I looked out over the lake, I knew I had taken the first step in reclaiming my life. There was still a long road ahead, but I was ready to live for myself and no one else. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I truly felt free.